Hello, everyone. My name is Ava, and I'm a student here at McMaster in the Integrated Rehabilitation and Humanities program. I'm joined here by my fellow student.
Hi everyone, I'm Maya. I'm also a McMaster student doing my master's in health and aging. I also did my undergrad here at MAAC, and I myself am a disabled student. I'm autistic, and I also have an autonomic nervous system disorder. And so that gives a bit of context into my role in this field.
So, we are here today with Kate Brown and Ann Pottier to interview them as part of the Accessibility Hamilton Alliances, also known as AHA's Disability History Month initiative. So, we hope this inaugural History Month initiative will be informative, shedding some light on how disability and accessibility have been important to the history of our community here at McMaster and beyond, and how they can be important in the community for years to come. AHA believes strongly that only a fully accessible community can lead to every person having choice and self-determination. And it is only where a community has the freedom of choice that it can be a richer community, socially, economically, and physically. So, first off, I'd like to start off by introducing our two guests today. So, Ann Pottier is a recently retired Associate University Librarian and the past chair of the McMaster Accessibility Advisory Council for the last 20 years. She began working at McMaster in 1981, where she was instrumental in establishing McMaster's first library accessibility services office, which still operates today. She has been involved in various aspects of accessibility work, both on and off campus, including participating on the inaugural President's Advisory Committee on the Disabled, contributing to the development of the Student Development Center, now Student Accessibility Services, and the establishment of the McMaster Barrier-Free Design Standards Committee. Most recently, she participated in the creation of the McMaster Facility Accessibility Design Standards, MAAC FADS, the revisioning of the McMaster accessibility policy, and sat on the AODA Post-Secondary Education Standard Development Committee. Now we would like to introduce Kate Brown, who is the AODA Accessibility Consultant under the Office of the Vice-Provost, teaching and learning at McMaster University. She is leading a 2-year project with colleagues and partners exploring McMaster's academic and administrative readiness for the province's forthcoming AODA Post-Secondary Standard. Since 2017, Kate has combined professional and scholarly approaches to translating AODA, or accessibility legislation, and practice into university culture, underpinning this work with an intentional focus on disability inclusion and co-design approaches with communities of students, staff, and faculty with disabilities. For example, Kate co-developed McMaster's inaugural accessible education resource, Flex Forward, in 2017 with disabled staff, instructors, and students, co-developed the Disability Discussion Series with MSU Access in 2017, established a user testing project with students with disabilities in 2018, later running the project with disabled staff and students from 2020 till 2023, co-established and co-coordinated McMaster's Employee Accessibility Network for staff with disabilities from 2018 till 2024, and recently has co-designed and developed McMaster's first Student and Alumni Accessibility Council as part of her current institutional accessibility project focus. So first off, we have a question for Kate. Ontario legislated full accessibility by 2025 through the AODA in 2005. Some history. Do you think this goal will be achieved? And how do you think accessibility can be brought back into mainstream focus?
You don't know what the AODA is. Hopefully, folks know what the AODA is in 2024. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, which was preceded by the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, so sort of sequential legislation, throughout history, which I think there have been many folks in Ontario in particular who've played key roles in leading the development of that legislation, particularly disability activists, advocates, and lawyers were pretty instrumental in the development of that legislation. I have to say that the 3 reviews that I've read so far of our progress in implementing the AODA, each review seems to get more scathing in sort of the review of how we're doing in terms of progress. And I think there's many reasons for that. We can talk a little bit more in depth about the reasons why without covering the entire gamut. I come from a very specific positionality in this topic. So I've been doing disability and accessibility work for the better part of a decade, institutionally within a post-secondary context, coming up as a student and then moving into staff work, and now I'm kind of moving into research work. I've experienced disability sort of actively, symptomatically for about 16 years, but also like I'm a white lady who is sort of sitting in middle class privilege at the moment, didn't grow up with middle class privilege, but I think I would be identified as such today. A settler, like non-Indigenous. I come at the topic from a very specific professional and research focus, from a lived experience focus, but also with the understanding that I don't know everything. I don't have all the experiences that folks with disabilities across the province and the country would embody. So I can speak to this topic a little bit more fruitfully from a professional and academic lens and try to highlight the things that I might be missing in my analysis. So in those reviews, the real narrowed focus in the most recent review is that there really isn't a very good integration of user experience into the application and the implementation of AODA standards in the province. So there's this real disconnect between the practice of accessibility and the lived experience of persons with diverse disabilities. Even who's encapsulated by that definition of disability is complex. There's a lot of folks that get left out if you're not taking a particularly intersectional lens around disability. So you do see, I mean, like I was talking to Anne about this yesterday, and in fact, the word accessibility has actually become quite mainstream. So as people are talking about moving forward education, moving forward healthcare, moving forward sort of society contexts around organizing, increasingly, I would argue that actually there is quite an interjection of the word accessibility into that conversation. How accessibility is understood, how it's defined, how it's taken up and implemented is a different story. And so I would acknowledge that the folks that are most impacted by inaccessibility, so folks that are particularly marginalized, have experiences of disability or impairment that we're particularly bad at designing for or ignorant to, are still very much experiencing the impacts of inaccessibility. And I think maybe for those collectives of individuals, it really feels like we are moving extremely slowly, like we are not moving fast enough to meet the goals, especially since those goals have been legislated, right? So that history of that legislation, you know, it came into place in 2005. It was preceded by prior disability legislation, and we've had 20 years to implement varying degrees of standards and regulation. However, with saying that, you need a lot of resources to engage in specific types of design, accessibility fundamentally being a design practice. And in order to allocate those resources appropriately, you have to have a really strong value for what it is that you're allocating the resources to. So I come back to this thought time and time again. Well, okay, well, why aren't folks practicing accessibility? Oh, well, maybe they don't know about accessibility. Well, why don't they know about accessibility? Oh, well, maybe they're not engaging with folks with disabilities. Okay, why is that the case? Why are we not putting more money, attention, prioritization towards this area? I could be quite general or reductive and say like it's ableism, right? Like the lack of value, sort of the inherent attitude towards the value of persons with disabilities in broadly society, but let's say more specifically within a Canadian context, is something that needs to be contended with. I think that folks, much like we've been going through sort of understanding inherent biases towards racialized folks that have to do with Indigenous folks in truth and reconciliation, that have to do with LGBTQ plus communities, I think folks increasingly are starting to understand that really the lack of action around this particular practice that we're holding up and saying that we're practicing isn't happening in the way that persons with disabilities want and need, because we're still somewhat beholden to, I mean, some people call them unconscious biases. In some cases, they're quite conscious and overt biases towards persons with disabilities, and understanding what their values are and how valuable persons with disabilities are to communities, not just in terms of quote unquote diversity, but like actual tangible value and contribution to the development of society. And so, yeah, I mean, I think increasingly as we're trying to think about how to bring accessibility back into mainstream focus, first of all, maybe acknowledge that it is in the mainstream focus, but it's not being defined particularly accurately in terms of what accessibility is and how to meaningfully improve the circumstances and experiences of folks with disabilities because of the way that society and structures are currently designed. And also that it takes a bit of deep work. Like if folks really want to engage in accessible design practice, I think there's ways into the practice that are quite gentle and welcoming and like, come on folks, let's collectivize and do this together. And then I think you do have to take a bit of a step further and cede a little bit of your own power and look to people with lived experience, especially high impact disabilities and impairment, and say like, what's not working? Like, what's not working for you? Why is it not working for you? What are the particular structures and barriers and attitudes in place that are preventing this from working for you within your particular context?
Okay, moving on to the next question for Kate. So, historically, accessibility was mainly accessed by accommodating individual needs on a more case by case basis. And with the introduction of the legislation that we kind of talked about before, such as the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the ODA, and the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disability Act, the AODA, the focus shifted more towards creating accessibility for people with disabilities as a collective. However, it seems like this old approach of accommodations has returned. And instead of addressing the need for accessibility, it doesn't do a lot to benefit society as a whole, and it is expensive. So, how do you think society could move past the idea of just individual accommodations and focus on more like broad systemic accessibility?
Because it is really a complicated question to respond to, even though on the face of it, it might seem sort of like, oh, we'll just do this instead of that. And it's really historically contextualized. I am not an expert on the history of, and a little tiny bit of a trigger warning for anybody listening, but the institutionalization of folks with disabilities, but just keeping in mind that there's a real context of why societies have developed to be relatively inaccessible for persons with disabilities in Ontario, in Canada, in the quote unquote Western world, that is tied to particular practices for how persons with disabilities were treated up until, I mean, still currently there's institutionalization of folks with disabilities, but sort of mass deinstitutionalize efforts that took place in the 70s, 80s, kind of the early 80s time period. So just sort of that context is in order to set the stage to understand, well, why would we have created a system that only attends to individualized case-by-case accommodations when first trying to establish protections in human rights law? Because there's a duty to accommodate in human rights law, in Canada, international law, in Ontario, specifically translated. And the duty to accommodate protects, like within an Ontario context, it's all protected grounds. So there's a duty to accommodate where somebody could access individualized case-by-case accommodations for any of the protected grounds that sit under Ontario Human Rights Code, and they are varied, right? So race, creed, religion, gender, and gender identity were kind of recently added, and many more. There's many more, there's 16 grounds, and disability is one of them. What's interesting to think about is how frequently accommodations for persons with disabilities are accessed in comparison to other accommodations. So that's one thing to think about in terms of, okay, well, if you look at the Human Rights Tribunal, if you look at many universities in terms of their complaint resolution processes and how they're documenting the cases that come in around failure to accommodate, why are so many of those overrepresented by persons with disabilities? If you look at the context of universities specifically, because we're in a university context, why have so many students started entering into the university and accessing individualized accommodations, particularly in the past 5 to 7 years? Huge increases that folks, there's a particular report that was just written about this increase and the pressure that sits on those individualized accommodation systems. So just sort of contextualizing and understanding that during the time when accommodation processes were kind of solidified and operationalized within organizations like universities, in workplaces, there were very few persons with disabilities who were getting through the doors at that time. Again, Anne can speak more to this time period than I can, but Anne has frequently told me in sort of storytelling about the origins of the library accessibility services that there were maybe 2 or 3 folks that the libraries would be serving at that time, in comparison to 5,000 students that are currently registered with accommodation services in 2024. So there's been a lot of good movement in the sense that certain forms of access have enabled increasing access into the workplace, universities. It helps to contextualize a little bit as to why those numbers have increased in terms of accessing individual accommodations, in addition to some shifting policy and definition around disability. So there's a little bit of a history of that in Ontario, broadening access to accommodations for folks with mental health disabilities, for example, with some policy papers that took place in 2016, 2017. So we see like this huge rise. We see more and more folks accessing these individualized accommodations. And like, I mean, this is a little, again, general as a statement, but I've read about it. Usually a huge proportion of accommodations being accessed is indicative of a fairly inaccessible environment, right? So the accommodations process is kind of trying to capture what accessible design would theoretically try to account for. Accessible design, though, took off as a movement after accommodation processes had been established in workplaces and workplace law in organizations. So you see a real consistency of an accommodation process across the last 40, 50 years in organizations, where you see sort of a rise in interest in, I'd say, movement toward an adoption of accessible design principles. The real issue that I think is maybe at the heart of the question is how difficult it is to achieve the collectivity that you need in order to move toward accessible design as like the only practice. So if we were to imagine a world where we didn't need accommodation processes and folks who experience like impairments that really require accommodations in this day and age don't need them. It's been built into the environment, it's been built into practice, it's been built into even interpersonal relationships with folks. You have to imagine that every single person who is organizing within that organization, within that workplace context, within a municipality, for example, would all be practicing accessible design in some way or another, contextualized to their role. And it's a lot of work. I mean, I'd say that a lot of folks have moved in sort of ebbs and flows. There's been real rise, and then people get tired, and then there's a little bit of a drop, and then there's a rise again and a bit of a drop throughout history. It's usually contextualized with whatever the societal context is of the time. We saw a huge increase in consciousness and awareness around accessible design during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's the most recent sort of societal influence that I can point to that sort of put front and center, oh, we all have to do class online. This is terribly inaccessible to some. This is increasingly accessible for others who maybe hadn't historically had this level of access before. And then at a certain point, we all kind of hit like a plateau where it was like, no, actually, this is okay. Like this is really increased access to a larger group of people than ever before. And then we came back to fully in-person work environments with varying degrees of hybridization, right? So you see that push and that pull. My sense is that there might be a feeling that the individualized accommodation processes have come back into sort of mainstream focus as we've hit another mass fatigue around the collective organization of accessibility. And so now there's maybe a bit of a slowdown in that focus on collective and broad access. And the accommodations process kind of gets elevated during those periods of time, especially when so many people are accessing them. And coming back to in-person environments, I could use post-secondary institutions as the perfect example. But I just want to sort of emphasize that these two things really shouldn't be contrasted as working against each other. In many ways, the way that accessibility is framed in human rights legislation is that it is necessary to engage in successful implementation of accommodations. So, for example, if a person is low vision or blind, they rely on screen reader technology, and that's their personal device that they use in order to navigate informational context, digital informational contexts. If that digital space is not coded properly, if it has not been designed accessibly for screen reader access, then that person who uses a screen reader fundamentally can't access that environment. So in that scenario, the screen reader could be thought of as a type of accommodation or an individualized modification, and the environment is thought of as sort of the accessible environment that they're interacting with. If your courses, if your websites, whatever are highly inaccessible, then the screen reader won't be able to interact with it. So you really need to have both. You want fewer people accessing an individualized accommodation process because it's not tenable. It's not sustainable with such a large group of people. It was really designed for highly, highly individualized access. But if you don't have accessible environments to correlate and correspond with your accommodation process, your accommodations won't work very well and they will increase in numbers. So I just, I always want to be careful in these conversations because lots of folks with disabilities have worked for decades to get human rights protections for accommodations. So we don't want to run the risk of saying like, okay, accessibility is the easy answer, just practice accessibility and then you'll no longer have to implement accommodations. It can lead to people in some contexts refusing accommodation or rejecting accommodation because they feel like they've done enough to, sort of make that particular environment accessible when it's not working for that particular individual. So that's sort of, again, my long, complex, and somewhat academic response to your question, but it's a good question and it's a very layered question.
It is great. And I just want to remind everybody, though, that on top of all of this, over the last 40 years, there's been a huge amount of work done in accessibility, which is just taken for granted now, too. So our environments are more accessible, our transportation, digital stuff, all the work has been done, or much work has been done in those areas. And we don't even think about that anymore. Because where we were in 1981 when I started at the university and where we are today are not the same places at all, either on campus or just walking around society. Like there's been so many advances related to accessibility that benefit all of us. We don't think about it anymore. And my analogy I've always used through the years is the blue box recycling system, how they used to have to fight with us to separate out our blue box stuff and get it out to the curbs and stuff. And now no one thinks about recycling and blue box. It's a way of life. There's a lot of accessibility work that's already been done that you won't even be aware of because you just assume that that's the way it should be. So while Kate is exactly right in what she's been saying, I just want to remind everybody that 40 years ago, there wasn't anything, there were no curb cuts. And you'll hear that the very first thing we did at McMaster was put in curb cuts, which benefited people with wheelchairs at the time, but also benefited people mothers with strollers who didn't have to heave their strollers up and down off curbs. So a lot of work has been done that's just now taken for granted too.
I also just wanted to comment a little bit on some of the things that you brought up around like case by case basis with accommodations. Just to share, I'll probably edit this out. But I experienced that going through SAS as a student. Like I did my undergrad here at McMaster too. And at the start, it was a great thing to be able to apply and know that I had some protections as a student. But when I got to my upper years, I was in inquiry-based classrooms. I was in small classrooms with 20 people and I got to know everyone to the point where I felt safe to disclose that information. And I had systems set up with my facilitators. So I was able to mention to them if I was having a bad health day, and I didn't have to go to an institution level system to get that support. I was able to go to them as people, as a classmate. And I think that's one of those accessible things that I wasn't recognizing as something that was making the environment more accessible for me, but that made so much of a difference for me.
I think you should keep that in, Maya. Just it's very rare that folks talk about accessibility within sort of a interpersonal cultural context. So the idea that you actually didn't need a whole lot of structural environmental design in your grad studies context. It sounds like from what you described that the accessibility that you were afforded was through interpersonal relationship development and feeling safe to talk about your experiences and sort of just creating alternative plans, but within the context of ongoing classroom business. This is just normal as opposed to having to trigger, a grad student level accommodation process, which can be clunky in that particular context. It's a very small, intimate environment. So I think that's a really lovely example, and keep it in. That's my advice.
Thank you. Onto the question for Anne, though, we're going to go back into discussing more about the physical environment on campus. So we know that McMaster has undertaken a number of accessibility projects over the years. How are the campus grounds and buildings different in their accessibility today than in the initial United Nations Year of the Disabled in 1981?
So I joined the university in 1981. There were only 7,500 students in total and probably half the number of buildings we currently have. We have 38,000 students now, just to put that into perspective. And as Kate said, I think we're just over 5,000 who are served through this student accessibility office. At the time, we probably had 2 students with disabilities. One was a blind student with a guide dog. She lived in residence and she had to figure out everything on her own. Another was a student who pushed his wheelchair backwards around campus. He had his head backwards so he could see where he was going. And he also had to figure everything out on his own. Nothing had been done at that point to make the campus more accessible. It wasn't even a word that people discussed. It wasn't on anyone's radar. The first President's Advisory Committee on the Disabled was created around 1984, and its purpose was to begin to oversee minor accessibility-related changes on campus. The first one being, as I said earlier, the creation of curb cuts, which you wouldn't even think about anymore, right? I started the inaugural library services for disabled around the same time, providing direct support to students with disabilities. There might be maybe a half a dozen or more by that time, helping them navigate their research requirements because there was no internet. Everything was done in paper. The indexes and abstracts, you had to search for citations. This one individual is in a wheelchair, did not have the use of his hands. So I would actually help him turning pages, pulling books down, reading content to him. He used a typewriter with a pencil in between two toes, and he typed his notes with a typewriter on the floor and a mirror so he could see what he was typing. We used to read articles to students who had visual impairments because they couldn't access them themselves. So it was small potatoes in terms of service, but it was critical for those students. Over the next few years, there were more committees that started on campus and more work started to make the campus more accessible. PACBIC, which is the President's Advisory Committee on Building an Inclusive Community, was created in 2002. There's always been a strong accessibility presence there. The McMaster Accessibility Advisory Council, known as MAAC, was created about 15 years ago. This council is comprised of senior leaders from all administrative and academic areas on campus. Over the years, many people in many different areas on campus have worked together to make it more accessible by ensuring there's things like an accessible entrance for every building, that accessible and now also gender-neutral washrooms exist in every building, that elevators with speech enunciation systems and braille markings are available. We have accessible water fountains and/or water refill stations. We have accessible rooms or suites in many of our residents. We have accessible parking spots. And about 5 years ago, we launched an accessible campus shuttle.
And could you comment a little further on additional measures that have been undertaken to make classrooms specifically and labs, those actual learning environments, more accessible?
Yep. My major involvement there has been in the creating of more accessible classrooms and labs. So that's what I'll talk about the most, if that's okay. First, we need to acknowledge that what is now Student Accessibility Services was created about 35 years ago. This was necessary to formalize the support students with disabilities needed to be successful in their academic journeys. The new SAS grew out of the informal supports we were providing in the library, but mostly because there were so many more students with disabilities and they needed far more support and different kinds of support than the library could provide. In addition to working with students and faculty to make sure the proper academic supports were in place, we also needed to look at the classrooms and labs where the learning was taking place. And we were dealing with buildings that are now almost 100 years old. Accessibility was not something taken into consideration as part of that design process for sure. Some of the initial changes made to classrooms included providing space for users with mobility devices, but it often wasn't the best space nor in the best area in the classroom. It was pushed off to the side or at the very back. It was just they needed to do it, so a space was created. We installed FM systems that worked with hearing aids for people with hearing impairments many years ago, and the technology was just not very good and it wasn't used very much. But more recently, we've installed height adjustable podiums and assistive hearing systems in all of the 130 registrar'd controlled classrooms. We've also installed Echo 360 lecture capture system in all registrar'd controlled classrooms. This system allows anyone in a class to access a captured audio and/or video version of each of their classes, each session of their classes. They can then replay the recording with or without captions and/or search and review a transcript of the video. For some students, access to Echo 360 is part of their formal accommodation process through SAS, but it benefits all of the students, including mature students who are coming back to school and finding the pace quite to be interesting and learning how to keep up with everything they're learning, and also students where English isn't their first language. Echo 360 also became critically important during COVID. As Kate has alluded to, there was many things that happened during COVID when we had to switch to fully virtual. If Echo 360 hadn't been in place, I think there would be many students who wouldn't have been able to complete their studies during those years. About 10 years ago, the Campus Renovation Committee was created to try to address the 10 worst classrooms on campus, identified through a survey by both students and faculty. This committee was comprised of representatives from facility services, faculty members, educational technology specialists, the staff who maintained the actual technology, the staff who maintained the physical classrooms, the custodians, staff from the registrar's office, myself with an accessibility lens, and both undergraduate and graduate student representatives. The campus provided $10 million over 10 years to improve the classrooms. Changes were made to include power-assisted entrance doors, a variety of seating types and sizes, multiple locations for those using mobility devices, the use of tables with power instead of swing arm tablets, adjustable lighting, sound dampening, additional and more strategically placed speakers and microphones. Of course, the style of the classroom tiered, like a tiered lecture hall or a flat floor would dictate what's actually possible in each room. And we've now created a template which will be used when creating new classrooms in the future to make sure we don't lose track of all those features which can help enable the student success. Similar work is being done to take accessibility into consideration when renovating existing labs and especially when designing new labs on campus. As part of the AODA, MAAC and other affiliated groups on campus have been working hard over the last several years to improve the accessibility of digital technology on campus. All videos created and posted by any size department must be captioned. UTS has been working with the administrators of all major campus websites to ensure they will be fully compliant with the WCAG 2.0 AA standard by the end of 2024. And many faculties have recently hired digital accessibility specialists to help ensure their websites became and then remain accessible. Under the AODA, the library is obligated to provide support to students in terms of helping them do their research, to provide all of their materials for anyone who's visually impaired or has a learning disability where they need to receive their materials in an alternate format. We're required to do that. So library accessibility services has grown, but we now work with student accessibility services to provide accommodations to a subset of student accessibility services, the students registered with student accessibility services. Not all SAS students need our services. We've also created the CATS technical campus assistive technology space, which is in the Mills Library, as a space where students who are registered with student accessibility services can go and get specific support from staff who are trained to help them, but also to access the space that has specific technology in it It has some sensory-free areas. There's lots of things and special equipment that can actually help students register with student accessibility services. Again, succeed. Everyone's bottom line is helping the students succeed, right? Sometimes you just can't wave your magic wand and put in an elevator and make it perfect. You have to do something that's going to suffice until a major change is made. The law does require us, though, if you're doing any major renovations, to upgrade everything to the current level of standards and code. And so if certain buildings underwent large renovations, they would have to do something more than what they put in place as a temporary measure. And temporary, just like we have temporary buildings on campus, could be 30 or 40 years. We have some temporary buildings on campus that have been around 30 years, and they're still called temporary building. T13 is a good example.
I just wanted to ask a more personal question. And Kate, I'll ask this question to you. So you're kind of a champion for accessibility at McMaster, one of them. So would you have any recommendations or any advice to like disabled students like right now today?
Okay. Yes. And that like there are lots of good things that lots of folks could contribute to this particular response, and not to take this as like elder Kate giving, like elder millennial Kate giving the Gen Z's advice. Like that's not what I'm doing, right? Just sort of maybe some things to consider as you're either beginning or moving through your academic journey. And this will be a little bit, I tend to respond to things in multiplicity. So if I go off in multiple directions, I apologize in advance. It's just the way that I communicate. So maybe first and foremost, if you feel when you first get here lonely, like you don't belong, like the university is extraordinarily difficult to navigate because it's extremely complex, those feelings are real, those feelings are valid. I think that many students experience sort of a bit of a shock when they first come to a university environment, particularly in Canada, where you have to travel quite far to go to a university in many cases, and it's quite far from home. And I think that that can be extraordinarily exacerbated for students with disabilities, particularly students who have experienced the impact of disability throughout their formative and developmental years, right? There's a lot there. Like university has really been developed in 2024 for sort of a social experience to be integrated into the academic experience. And I think this can be particularly impactful for students who've been socially impacted or socioeconomically impacted by impacts of disability. So just sort of your feelings are real and valid. Universities are extraordinarily complex as organizations. And it's just interesting listening to Anne talk about all the evolutions in technology and infrastructure over the years that have really been either been led by, but in some cases forced to respond to the increasing complexity of human existence, information systems, this combination of digital and physical spaces that we find ourselves in increasingly. Really, if you're not thinking about certain types of design for certain types of people from the outset of all of these evolutions and progressions, you'll always see these systems trying to push to either catch up, integrate accessibility after the thing has been designed and deployed, and right. So it's just thinking about that. I think that students might experience a little bit of unevenness when they first come into the university. They might try to go and access a particular space that's designated and built around the student experience, and it's an incredible experience. They have a great time. It feels really welcoming, like they belong. It's highly accessible. And then maybe they go to one of their classes in the basement of one of our old 150-year-old buildings, and the experience is quite different, quite an uneven experience. So I won't get into the history as to why that is, because I think that's too much of a response, but just to prepare yourselves for sort of this initial unevenness that you might experience when you're first, it might not be the smooth integrated experience that you're really hoping for it to be, but in some ways that's kind of beautiful because that's the way that universities have evolved. If you had that smoothness, that integrated feeling across the whole campus, you might end up finding that, there's a lot of homogeneity that's happening across the disciplines. And it's nice to have distinctiveness in different areas. what we are aiming for is that within particular spaces, folks have really made efforts to contextualize accessibility to that space, to that discipline, to that group of people. So even if the experience is a little uneven, it's still accessible. You're still able to access whatever it is that you're trying to participate in. I might also say to students, there are many groups and communities that you can connect into. So MAAC has quite a history. In fact, again, I'll point back to that little chapter that we wrote on connecting a disability history over the past 40 years at MAAC. And while I have not been part of all of that organizing that's taken place, I have a dear colleague who's traced that history of disability organizing at MAAC back 50 years, at least, within McMaster, with sort of names of different groups of communities of folks with disabilities since like the 1970s. I think maybe even some case, maybe the late 60s, but there's definitely presence in the archives of disability, kind of tracing back quite far. And there's also quite a deep history of disability organizing and advocacy in Hamilton. So you folks are partnered with a well-known disability activist and accessibility champion, Tim Nolan. Tim was at MAAC for decades. He was also working with the city in the accessibility advisory capacity. And there are additional groups. There's l'Arche, which is sort of a group for intellectually disabled and non-intellectually disabled folks to live together in community. There's the Disability Justice Network of Hamilton, or of Ontario, that is situated in Hamilton, actually started by McMaster graduates. And I was really happy to be part of the initial conference that sort of led to the development of that network. So if you are looking for community, and if you're looking specifically for disability community, if you're wanting to connect with other students with disabilities, I think AHA is like a great example of a group that's just kind of sprung up. There's MAACCess, which has at least, I think, 10 years at this point of organizing that they've done. Good group, also founded by disability justice activists at MAAC. There's the Disability Action Group in social work. There's McMaster Engineers with Disabilities, which has come up in the past couple of years. That group has formed. And then there's also, I think it was previously the MAD Student Collective, which is now maybe the Mental Health Student Collective, or there's another name that they've transferred into, but has a history in sort of critical MAD studies and organizing around mental health and psychiatric survivors. So bottom line, summary, like the too long didn't read version, if you're looking for community, if you want to hang out with other students with disabilities, just Google it. Like, there's so many opportunities at MAAC to connect in with peers. And then the third thing that I might...
Ben, just so there's also demand at PAC.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Not specifically just students, but the Disability Inclusion Madness Accessibility and Neurodiversity Working Group.
Thank you.
Under PACBIC is a great group. They really focus on critical disability, critical MAD studies, kind of advocacy, but at the level of institutional organization work. So that's a great group of folks as well. Acronym DEMAND. Many thanks to Gina Zarofsky, who's an incredible professor at McMaster in English and Cultural Studies, for helping us craft that very nice acronym. And previously that group had been called ADA MEDS. So it was previously two working groups that combined and then moved into a different name. So you might find some history of that online as well. And then the third thing, if folks have like gotten here, gotten used to the unevenness, found their supports, gone to SAS if they need to, found some folks in community, if you have energy, if you have time, if you have interest, recognize who's not in those communities and ask the question, why? The answer exists in the literature. There's lots of historical, contextual, theoretical, and lived experience realities around, for example, why there's not great representation of Indigenous students with disabilities in a lot of these community groups, how disability is framed within communities of folks who have been marginalized and oppressed, Black folks, Indigenous folks, the intersection of queerness and disability as being, I'd say, somewhat described in disability studies literature, but maybe more from non-racialized perspectives. So just sort of asking yourself the question, if I'm not seeing a lot of folks with visible disabilities, if I'm not interacting with a lot of folks who are deaf and hard of hearing, low vision and blind, if students who are racialized and disabled are not coming to my events, why? Is it because these students aren't at McMaster? In some cases, Yes, and that's like a harsh reality that university is not universally accessible for all groups of people. And we do have very low representation of students who have mobility disabilities and who are deaf and hard of hearing and who are blind and low vision. I think the numbers are slowly increasing, but that number has remained fairly constant across sort of years. So asking that question. And then, if you're trying to figure out ways to bring folks into community, maybe do a little bit of reading, like maybe go into the Disability Justice Network of Ontario's website, read a little bit about that history. So that's a movement that was created by racialized and queer disabled folks in community, not in universities, not within an academic context. And, understanding a little bit about those intersecting histories, legislation, sort of the legislation of exclusion in Canada. There's a lot of great information on that website about that particular topic and those intersecting histories. And just kind of dig in if it's interesting to you. I always try in my accessibility practice to keep a critical perspective. Like, yeah, I'm practicing accessibility, but for whom? Who's it benefiting? How am I implementing the practice? Who am I leaving out of my designs? And so I have to, apply a little bit of a critical lens. But that's like the best part about coming to university is that's what you're learning to do. You're learning to apply a critical lens to the things that you do day to day to hopefully make it better, to hopefully broaden our definition of disability community within the McMaster context, but also maybe a bit of a broader context if we're sort of looking at Hamilton, Ontario, et cetera. Yeah, and and I will caveat that response and sort of summarize or like end my response by saying, if you don't have energy to do all that stuff, that's okay too. Like if you just want to exist in a disabled body and get through university, just do that. Find all the support you can, all the resources you can, and get to the finish line because it's very tiring being disabled in higher education. And if you need to take care of yourself and not do all that activist work, that's also okay too.
The other thing is, yes, whatever people have the spoons for, the energy for, it's so important to consider. And sometimes in the grind of university culture, it can be something that there's a lot of pressure to look past and to keep up with everyone who's around you, to be that busy university student who's so productive.
Can I just finish with one thing? So I know one of the things that we were going to talk about at some point was whether full accessibility can ever be achieved. And I just, in a nutshell, the answer is no, it can never be achieved fully because it's something that's always going to be evolving in response to the changes our users with disabilities have, changes in technology. One thing I can say is that I don't believe that accessibility is considered a dirty word at McMaster anymore. After decades of having to always be the one to raise my hand, to remind people, oh, we got to think about this when we're planning something that might be creating a barrier instead of removing a barrier. I'm really pleased that at every table I sit at these days, it doesn't matter how senior the level is, accessibility is discussed on a daily basis. It is always there now, which could never been before. So it's not a fad. This is lots of discussion, lots of awareness raising, lots of training has helped to create a campus which is really open to doing as much as possible where accessibility is involved. So I want to sort of end on a positive note that a lot of really, really good work is happening and will be continuing to happen. And I'll be watching it from afar and waiting to see all the good stuff that's still to come.
To end off, I just wanted to say thank you to both Kate and Anne for being here with us today. And I just want to thank you so much for being part of the first ever Disability History Month initiative at McMaster. So your stories and your messages are very important and very inspirational to faculty, students, and staff of McMaster and beyond. Thank you.